Hello. Arthur was my first project in this, so I'm having to rack my brains to get all the Arthurian dates right. Now, driving into Glastonbury, you pass a sign that says, "Welcome to Glastonbury, ancient Isle of Avalon." So it's really nailing its colours to the mast as you go through. This is not your average Somerset market town, and I know some of you live there and you know this, and Glastonbury Abbey is not your average monastic ruin as a result. Walking down the high street of Glastonbury, you quickly become aware of why the town has been described as a New Age Mecca. However, in the Abbey, New Age interests mixed with medieval legends and also Western esoteric traditions to create a particularly heady cocktail of theories and legends. In Glastonbury, esotericism and archaeology aren't really separate. As separate as we'd like to think they are. And in this paper I talk about Glastonbury's claim to Arthur and the people who believe they're spiritually and literally searching for Avalon. Now, yes.
Which in British speak, that's 24 Celsius.
Yeah. For those of you who haven't been to Glastonbury, I've just put this up and you can see that is the tour, that is Chalice Hill and Chalice Well there. That is the Abbey, and that's the High Street, and you have Wiriel Hill, and correct me people who know more about Beckley because I can't see that well, it's around there, am I right? The major thing is you can see the Abbey. People talk metaphorically and quite literally about it being the heart of the town, and you can see that it does, the entire town rotates around it. So this is the ancient Isle of Avalon, and driving to it on a very misty day, you can really see why people still connect to it in this way. And in this paper, I'm going to talk a little bit about the reception of Arthur. I'm going to talk about Glastonbury's specific claim, which Tim's already mentioned a little, and whether it was this popular cult. I agree with Tim that there's not a lot of evidence that it was a popular cult. It seems really linked to the kings. And then I'm going to talk about the archaeological hunt for Arthur and how various people who were influential in Arthurian studies have actually come to be focused in Glastonbury. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about key aspects of the Arthurian corpus that have a real effect today. So I apologise to any Arthur specialists if my date's not quite right, but you see Glastonbury monks exhume Arthur, that's 1191. The Avalonians were looking from sort of 1880s onwards, and the hippies and the festival, sorry for the use of the word hippies, but that's, some people have used that with me, so from the 60s and 70s. And you can see it kind of coincides with interesting phases in the development of the Arthur myth. As Roberta said, I'm just coming to the end of a 3-year AHRC-funded PhD working with the University of Reading and the trustees of Glastonbury Abbey, which examines contemporary responses to the Abbey's intangible and intangible heritage. As Lynn Maskell recently noted, this kind of hybrid fieldwork is becoming increasingly common in archaeology. There's also a growing field of research into what's called folk archaeology. For example, Gazin Schwartz and Holtoff's 1999 volume called Archaeology and Folklore. A major outcome of this project has been the development of a new interpretation strategy, which brings the evidence from the Excavation Archive project to life, whilst respecting the fact that the Abbey is still a living spiritual space for a lot of people. A key strand of the Abbey's legendary history is the belief that Arthur was buried there, and as Tim said, this is made a great deal of today. In 1191, the monks claimed to have dug up the bones of Arthur and Guinevere, possibly Mordred, depending on which version you read. After this date, the identification and the bones themselves were mobilized in a series of interesting symbolic displays and discussions of spirituality and identity. In this paper, I will outline how Glastonbury came to be identified as the final resting place and how the interplay happens today. The key to understanding the significance of Arthur today is that Arthur is not the story. He's just a major character on the stage, which is Avalon. Focus on this first and then you can get the picture of Clive Owen. Slightly more interesting. The Arthurian corpus is huge, and key elements such as Lancelot and the Holy Grail, while they existed in some form, they only officially became attached in the 12th and 13th century, which is around the time all the interesting stuff's happening at Glastonbury as well. And they're mainly known to us through 19th century revivals of these myths. And in simple terms, Arthur is a mythological, but possibly based on some element of truth, 5th or 6th century British leader who fought a Saxon army. However, Arthurian studies explores much more widely what we call the Arthurian corpus, and also these constant revisions. Modern researchers are not looking so much for a real Arthur. Since Dunville's article in the early 70s, they are looking at Arthur as a symbol. But Glastonbury is one of those key places where they're looking for Arthur as a real person. Arthur really only appears in his modern form in the written record in the 12th century. The name appears in tiny fragments, what I'm talking about as pre-Galfridian there. But you get Celtic sources, you get tiny little bits, you get lives of saints. There's Geoffrey of Monmouth who really picks it out. He's credited with consolidating these fragments in Britain and the creation of a Christian English king. He really kind of claims Arthur for a historic tradition from these oral traditions which are going on. And it's happening at quite an interesting time in terms of what's happening with the relationship between English kings and Welsh and Scottish kings. It's interesting that they're picking up these Celtic traditions. Glastonbury's connection emerges just as you start to get into the heyday of the French romances and just kind of at the end of British histories. So there's a really interesting crossover point. And it's quite interesting that Gerald of Wales says, it's translated from Latin, but the fairy tales have been snuffed out. The Glastonbury claim is about killing the king and saying not only is he dead, but we've got him, and displaying him. It's quite a stark statement to make. So here's Clive Owen. In the late 1960s, there was a hunt for Arthur at Cadbury, which you might know about with the Camelot Project. The team behind this excavation brought together people like Geoffrey Ashe and Raleigh Radford, who are both major figures in the history of the study of Glastonbury. Since the 1970s, archaeologists are not digging for Arthur so much, but academic studies from this period still really influence people who are interested in Arthur. So people still, lots of authors say they read Alcock and they read Morris, and they know about these projects, and they read things like Radford and Swanton. So these books, even sort of 30 years after they're no longer necessarily archaeologically current, are still being used. In their analysis of Arthurian literature, Taylor and Brewer, 1983, noticed that since the World War II, research into the Dark Ages has led Arthur to be reimagined in popular culture as a Dark Age kind of barbarian warlord in a time of religious strife following the Roman removal from Britain. Sklar notes that a number of Arthurian role-player games also emphasize their use of early sources and Celtic sources, as these are seen as more authentic in some way. Ray Thompson did a series of interviews with Arthurian authors in quite a broad term, and he found that a lot of them talked about Rosemary Sutcliffe's work, and they also talked about reading these archaeological texts. And if you look, if anyone's read Bernard Cornwall's Warlord Chronicles, the description of Merlin's castle at the beginning is basically taken from Ratz's description of the settlement on the Tor. So he's really tapping into this, and it is described as Ynys Wyttrin, which is the name that is used in Glastonbury. And Fuqua's version of King Arthur uses the Sarmatian connection. The actual poster says the truth behind the legend. And I think it begins with the words historians believe, considering there's quite a tiny sect of historians who go with the Sarmatian connection and all these kind of things. It's quite a strong statement to make. What you do get is this sense that the idea of Arthur as a Christian king has lost some of its currency in the modern age. I did interviews with people around Glastonbury, and somebody said, this idea of this imperialist male Christian symbol, it doesn't really speak to people in the modern age. He's quite a sort of an old-fashioned icon. But as the Arthurian corpus is so great, there's always room for movement. You see, the other thing you see with modern ones is this idea of times of religious strife. They use Arthur to talk about the battle between paganism and Christianity. Christianity often seen as this patriarchal oppressive force. I'm referring, of course, to the seminal BBC's Merlin, which is a children's show, if people haven't seen it, in which case every week witches come in and try and kill try and destroy the court of Avalon. You also see it in Marion Zimmer Bradley and in Bernard Cornwell, obviously. The problem with Glastonbury's claims is pretty firmly rooted in the idea of Arthur as a Christian English king. And so it doesn't tap into the magic, really. So these are some rough dates. If you're interested in the details of this, please look at J.P. Carley's 2001 Glastonbury and the Arthurian Tradition, which brings together various articles which pick apart the difference between Fecunda and Secunda and all the details, but I won't go into that here. These documents suggest that the exhumation was conducted at least partly at the behest of King Henry II, although the actual exhumation might have happened in the reign of Richard the Lionheart. And the rationale used is that there was a great fire and they needed to get more pilgrims in. People really discuss whether there was a popular tradition or a cult of Arthur going on that this was reacting to. It's very much seen, told in sort of Whig history terms, as abbots and kings coming together to put together this hoax. And it is pretty universally seen by academics as a hoax, although a lot of people in Glastonbury like to think that it's a bit more, there's a little bit more to it, that there might be some kind of symbolic truth in there. So it's very much to do, if you see the visits of the kings, they're very much linked with troubles in Wales and Scotland, and that's seen as a major thing. And if you look at the later one with John Leyland, and Eustace Chappers says that he sees that he saw a seal, and he can't remember exactly where it's from, whether it's from Glastonbury or whether it's from Westminster, but that's to do with Arthur as an imperial lord. And he uses that, the Duke of Norfolk shows it to him to emphasise that Britain has some kind of independence from Rome at a very important point. From the historical record, we get a sense that the initial exhumation, after the initial exhumation, the body was mainly used as a ritual of kingship. I haven't been able to find any references to healing miracles, and I completely concur with Tim on this, or any kind of devotional activity. And given the placement near the high altar, they wouldn't be able to be accessed on a daily basis in the way that the Lady Chapel or the crypt of Joseph Aaron Steele would. So it's not clear how much this is attracting a popular audience. Tim was talking about the skulls being moved, and you've got this idea of linking with sort of coronation rites, maybe rather than seeing them as saintly relics, although there is an element of translation going on there as well. So what's interesting about all this moving about of bones and putting them in a tomb is that we have some archaeological evidence to do with it. And people, because the written evidence is so difficult, are quite interested in what archaeologists have to say about it. As this is an archaeological symposium, it's interesting to examine the archaeological responses, especially because they tell us something about the significance of the myth to 20th century academics. In the 1960s and 1970s is when the sort of hunt for Arthur archaeologically really hit up the UK, and it was very much focused around the southwest. The map I had from Radford and Swanton emphasised that aspect, and Radford was a key figure in popularising that. Raleigh Radford's middle name was Arthur. He was a key member of the Camelot Project, and with Swanton he wrote this key text. He dug at both Tintagel and Glastonbury, and Cadbury. He was involved in Cadbury, so that's the three key archaeological sites they used in these books. However, in Gilchrist's upcoming memoir for the British Academy, she re-examined some of his findings from Glastonbury, and she argues that his personal interest in Celtic Christianity and in the legends of the west of England may have distorted his analysis of evidence of both sites. This is Radford in the grave, and you can kind of see, if you know Glastonbury today, that's the lower part of the Lady Chapel, and this is where the tomb is marked at today. This is on Google Earth. I took it the other day. There's masses of people around there, and the rest of the site looks fairly empty, but there's a cluster of people around Arthur's tomb, so it shows how important it is today. Written sources said that the grave was dug up between two pyramids in the monks' cemetery to the south of the Lady Chapel, and it gives some rough dimensions of things like William of Worcester. In 1962, Radford said there was a high probability that he found the grave, but in 1975 he was much more clear that he believed he found the grave. And I'm quoting from Radford here. There is no reason to doubt the actual report of the 12th century exhumation. Excavation has shown that between the presumed site of the two standing crosses, a large irregular hole had been dug out, then shortly afterward refilled in the 1180s or 90s. The evidence for this precise dating is found in the occurrence in the holes of mason's chippings of Dolting stone, which was then first used at Glastonbury in rebuilding the Lady Chapel in 1184 to 1189. The bottom of the hole had been disturbed. At the bottom of the hole had been disturbed 2 or possibly 3 slab-lined graves belonging to the earliest phase of the Celtic cemetery. Analysis of the records, if you see the section, shows that this is basically a pit. It's not a grave. It roughly matches the description of the dimensions given in the medieval written records. Dolting was the primary building material, and it's found in all phases, so that can't be securely used as dating evidence. Roberta, I don't know whether you remember, briefly talked about those Celtic kist graves earlier. They're cut into Dunstan's clay, which is 10th century, so that's not secure dating evidence either. So I would say at the end, if you have specific questions about that, please ask Roberta, because she knows the archaeology very well. But don't ask her about the Holy Grail. I'll just get some water. Now, the other piece of really interesting archaeological evidence is something which we don't have, and Tim mentioned it. It's this black marble tomb. And Lindley's 2007 book on tomb destruction has a really interesting chapter where he tries to pick apart Leyland's description and really think about how this was used. And this is another interesting example where, if you see with Radford's grave, it's not marked on site anymore. I don't think that, and that sign has been, I think that sign has been taken down. And a lot of people don't know that it's there. When Jeffrey Ash does informal tours, he points it out to people. So there is a case of archaeologists being involved in the creation of these myths. Lots of people know about this. The tomb is a really interesting example. I got this from Lindley, but Tim has mentioned this before when he's been looking at tomb placement around. It's last described by John Leyland, who saw it in person, and he gives a fairly detailed description. Following the Reformation, it disappears from the material record, and even Leyland, when he's explicitly talking about Arthur, and he's talking about the seal at Westminster, doesn't mention what happened to the tomb. It's a fantastic mystery of what happened to it. Although I was told yesterday that apparently in 1981, a man walked into the British Museum claiming to have the lead cross, and eventually went to jail as a result of not producing it. So that's something I have to look into. But Lindley uses it to describe it, and basically it's raised, it's on lion's feet, it's a sort of tomb chest. Now this is actually sunk down, it's a shaft tomb, and also it's in completely the wrong place, given the description. Piers Clapham and Corn found it, and Lindley thinks they were just having a bit of a slow season, they hadn't found anything. And this is why it got marked out. Now, this is really important because I've talked to people who say that they feel there's an energy field around it, that they're focusing their psychical energy on this. There are members of staff and former members of staff around here who will have seen people laying there, chanting around it. It's a very important site. Tim has mentioned that it could have been recycled. Maybe it was an earlier, we don't know where it was earlier on. It could have been recycled and be used for an abbot or something like that, but we don't really know. But what we do know is that it would be much further up, and I think Tim's managed to kind of mark it out on the ground, given the walk to the spot, given the description. The other thing is Monington extended the choir, so there's a sense that it could have moved then as well. So yeah, not only is there no cloister, there's no tomb of Arthur. I'm just wondering which one we should want people to get more worried about. Okay, now, the Avalonians, this is Patrick Benham's fantastic book. I'd also recommend you read Tim's book on Blythebourne and see Tim's film, Glastonbury the Untold Story, in which you can see Tim managing to present while going backwards up a flight of stairs, which is quite a fantastic feat. Since the late 19th century, Glastonbury has drawn people who want to connect to its spiritual and cultural heritage. The first wave of people are referred to as the Avalonians. They refer to themselves in this term using the term Avalon. And the second, late 20th century wave often refer to themselves as the community of Avalon. Now, in the late 19th century, there was a flowering of interest in the occult, which has been written about in detail by Alex Owen and Joanne Pearson. This looked both to the east and the west, and that in terms of the west, Arthurian legends were very important. And the medieval period was an important storehouse of rituals and ideas. And it had been there'd been a growing interest throughout the Victorian period anyway. But from sort of 1850s and then 1880s onwards, they get this real interest in the occult aspects of it. There's also a real interest towards the end of the 19th century in the death of Arthur. But interestingly, not that much regarding Glastonbury, considering that's the place where he's supposed to have been found. It's much more, Poulsen looks at images of him, it's much more him going off into the sunset, and it's linked to Arthur as the Solar King, and linked with images of Jesus. She also links it with the death of Prince Albert. And if you look at Tennyson's Idylls of the King, it does make reference to that. So there's this real sense, which is remarked upon by historians of the late 19th century, that something is being lost, that we're entering the industrial age, we're entering an age of disenchantment. And Glastonbury was a very important centre in the development of these theories. And as I said, if you watch Tim's film, he talks with various people about these key figures. Frederick Bligh Bond talked about a group of people who watched over the Abbey and communicated with him, and he referred to them as the Company of Avalon. Catherine Maltwood, and we've already given about the Maltwood Trust a bit today, was a sculptor who, when creating an Arthurian map, noticed that certain figures could be mapped out on the Glastonbury landscape, including Arthur at Boltonsborough. So this is now the Glastonbury Zodiac, and that wasn't on that initial map, but there are lots of these sacred maps that go over the top. There are also ley lines that go through it. There's the Star Temple of Avalon. There are these, if you get one of these things, this crisscrossing of lines all over Glastonbury with these alternative sacred geographies. We're talking about Alice Buxton, and she lived at the Chalice Well Gardens. She put on various plays, and in 1925 she wrote a play called The Wooing of Guinevere for radio. Wellesley Tudor Cole was involved in the setting up of the Chalice Well, but he was also involved in the initial identification of the chalice, which was seen as the Holy Grail. And in Clifton, of all places, he had a chapel set up that initially only women could go into. And it's really interesting links with occultism and first wave feminism going on there as well. Dion Fortune's book was called Avalon of the Heart, and she talks about people as Avalonians. During the Battle of Britain, she believed that the negative energy of Nazism was affecting the country, and so she had her followers imagine the Tor hollowed out, and one of the figures in there was Arthur. And that was a way of focusing psychical energy to combat the negative psychical energy coming from the Nazi attack. So that's the history for this, and I have to say a lot of people today draw on this. There are a lot of people in Glastonbury who are very aware of that. I've talked to people who believe that they are spiritually in touch with Bligh Bond or other figures there, and say that they work with him. So they're seen as, when we're talking about these people as archaeologists in the past, they're still very important to people today. To understand modern Glastonbury, there's numerous articles by Marion Baumann, and Princes and Riches' book on the New Age in Glastonbury is also very interesting. Basically, since the late 1960s, people have been drawn by a generally Aquarian movement linked with the festival and a lot of specific historical issues.
What are you doing?
Okay, the major one here is Feminism and Avalon. If you've seen Zimmer Bradley's book, there is this real shift, a revisionist element in which women come to the foreground, and you can see this painting of Morgan there with the Tor in the background. Glastonbury, or the Isle of Avalon, was linked with Morgan and the Nine Maidens, and these are seen as the key figures in Avalon. This is also the goddess, which is mapped out on Glastonbury's landscape by Kathy Jones, and I should leave it to your imagination, but the abbey is somewhere around there. But figures like Morgan Le Fay, Vivian and Nimue have been reclaimed. There's this idea that the older, the French romances are this kind of Christian misogynistic way of looking at things, and that it needs to be changed. I've already mentioned the Grail. If you look at the Cauldron of Peregrine, Guyon Bach and the Tale of Taliesin, which is weirdly the only Arthurian thing that Disney have really latched onto. And The Spoils of Annuvin, which is this new book by Caitlin and John Matthews. There's this real sense that there's a secret within these Arthurian connections to Glastonbury to do with this idea of Glastonbury being, if not having the cup of Christ, then having some kind of symbolic resource. There's also the idea of it as a gateway to the underworld. Gwynach Neave is seen as the king of the fairies in later Welsh mythology, and he guards Annuvin, which is the gateway to the Celtic underworld. So if you read about Glastonbury today, you get these things being brought up a lot more than you get the kind of medieval connections. So displaying Arthur today, I've talked with various visitors, and they said, they joked with me because my name, they knew I was Welsh, and they were going, well, aren't you guys supposed to have them? And Richard Barber's work on the Welsh Arthurs has clearly been really influential, and a lot of people questioning this. Also, I think a lot of the tacky merchandise to do with Arthur has led people to question things. I thought, talking to the community of Avalon, more people would be interested, but as I've already said, I think there's a shift away from this, and feminist revisions of Arthur, Dark Age Arthur, and different links have got more weight today. This is a statue that was put forward as an idea to put on the tomb of Arthur, and a lot of people did react saying, is it too tacky to tap into Arthur? Do we need to tap into older myths? Do we need to tap into the truth of Glastonbury, whatever that was for them? The idea that Arthur is somehow commercial is quite strong in Glastonbury, and that's going to be really interesting in terms of how we interpret it in the future. So the key Arthurian truth, which the medieval and modern reimaginings of Arthur at Glastonbury seem to hold for modern seekers, is that of Avalon. It's this idea of a blessed isle or a place between worlds, or Dion Fortune said the veil is thin here. And in the end of Zimmer Bradley's book, Morgana comes back and she says the pagan pieces you can see are Avalon peeking through the mists into Glastonbury. So we get these universal ideas of this blessed isle or this garden of apples and a place of transformation. So they're part of a much wider belief about Glastonbury as a sacred place. So in conclusion, if we're to understand modern Arthurian connections in Glastonbury, we need to think less of the man and more of the magic and also the topography of these legends. 20th century archaeologists, alternatives and esotericists have sought Avalon for often not that different reasons. This search for Avalon is an attempt to re-enchant the modern world, and Glastonbury's communities are at the forefront of